Oh, you did it. There you go. Thank you. All right, everybody. Well, welcome. We are so thrilled to have everybody here. So this is the AHN Department of Neurosurgery second annual Joseph C. Maroon Equanimitas Lectureship. As most of you know, we had our first lectureship last year. It was in the spring of 2023. And Dr. Maroon was our guest lecturer. And for those of you who don't know Dr. Maroon, he essentially is a neurosurgical icon. He is a decorated triathlete, and he's also an author. And without him and his generosity, none of this would be possible. So we're so thankful for all you've done for neurosurgery and resident education. And for the second year, we have Dr. Roger Hartl, who's come to us from New York City at the Weill Cornell Medical College. So this lectureship was named after the title of the valedictory address given by Sir William Osler. And Sir William Osler, for those of you who don't know much about him, he was a physician founder of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and he gave this valedictory address to the medical students and the residents back in 1889 at the University of Pennsylvania. But when you dig a little bit deeper, and you can actually buy the book of the actual address, it opens up with a poem from Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and it's beautiful. So I'm going to read it to you now. So the poem is, "Thou must be like a promontory of the sea, against which, though the waves beat continually, yet it both itself stands, and about it are those swelling waves glided." So later on in his address, Dr. Osler also references another Roman emperor who is Antoninus Pius, and essentially on his deathbed, he coined the term equanimitas. And he described equanimity as something that everyone should strive for as balance in their life. And Dr. Osler, in his address, does emphasize the fact how difficult to attain equanimity, yet how necessary in success as in failure. So I think it's only appropriate that on the afternoon of graduation, that we look at the foundation of Dr. Osler's address, and he did write as well. And I think this is really profound. "The good physician treats the disease, and the great physician treats the patient who has the disease." He urged the graduates of the University of Pennsylvania to cultivate that degree of equanimity or balance that will enable you to meet the hardships of practice without, at the same time, hardening the human heart by which we live. And it's great advice. It's 130 years later, but it's still great advice. So it is my honor to welcome Dr. Maroon to the podium, and he is going to give us a few words and then introduce Dr. Hartl.
Thank you so very much, Jody. To again recapitulate what Osler said in 1897, when I was in the audience, that's when I was doing my residency. That's a joke. I'm old, but not that old, huh? But he said he urged physicians, listen carefully, to cultivate that degree of equanimity that will enable you to meet the exigencies or hardships of practice without hardening the human heart by which we live. And as so many of you know, in today's practice of medicine, it's very difficult. Too many people are inured, hardened to the problems of patients, their pain, and the human aspect behind people who have the neurological diseases and pain that we treat. And Osler also said, he was quite honest, and he said, well, preaching a degree of, or a message of equanimity, I myself am a castaway. So, you know, I speak a lot about balance, and many of us do, but it's a work in progress on a daily basis. And it's so important to not forget the human heart by which we live. And speaking of that, it's an incredible honor and privilege to introduce my close friend, colleague, who was a student and now is the teacher of me, Roger Hartl. Roger has had an incredible career. He started his MD degree at the University of Munich in Germany. And in 1997, several years after we began the program here at Allegheny General, I received a call, and Roger was applying for a residency slot here at AGH. And I understood him well. His English was good, but not perfect. And I said, I'm not sure another foreign body is needed here, but I was joking. And it ended up, we accepted Roger, and for 2 years, we taught him all he knows. And from here, he went to Barrow Neurological, where he spent a few years fellowship with Volker Sonntag, and then went to Cornell, and he's been there as an incredible contributor, not only to Cornell, New York, but also to World Neurosurgery. When I say World Neurosurgery, in 2008, Roger went to Tanzania as a reach out to enable others to experience neurosurgery as he felt it should be practiced in Africa at that time. At the time, there were 3 neurosurgeons for 40 million people. And he began the Global Health Initiative in Tanzania, and subsequently has trained, and he'll tell us about it, I think, 20 neurosurgeons who now populate Tanzania and administer to the neurosurgical problems in that vast country. And Roger got the highest honor from the AANS a couple of years ago when he received the Humanitarian Award, which is given to that individual who has contributed greatly to humanity and to people and to health. And Roger is one of the finest microvascular, microendoscopic neurosurgeons in spine in the world. He has a course every year that I would encourage any of you who can to attend on minimally invasive surgery of the spine. I was an invited guest there a couple of years ago, and it's just probably one of the best courses in the country for learning the nuances and the new techniques of neurosurgery of the spine. So, Roger, I could go on and on, but I'm going to leave you a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Well, Joe, that was too kind. I really appreciate the opportunity to be back here. I was here for 2 years, as you mentioned, and the only question that Joe asked me during the interview was if I knew a particular, he mentioned a name, I forgot the name, and I thought that was probably a famous neurosurgeon. It turned out it was a German triathlete who had won the championship, and I knew that person because I saw him from the back during the racing, and so because I knew that person, that's how I got into the residency. So thank you, Joe. That was a very nice introduction. And I was going to talk about minimally invasive spine surgery, but Jody, so it's her fault, she said, no, talk about something different. So with my background, having trained here and being close, first as a mentor, now really as a friend with Joe, obviously, he's really instilled a lot into my personal career and my life and my professional career. And a lot of it has to do with balance. And I figured maybe I'll take the opportunity today to talk a little bit about balance and what I have experienced over the years, what helped me kind of achieve a state of balance, hopefully, maybe not completely, but what has helped me really kind of travel the journey of neurosurgery. And I'll obviously refer to your work, Joe, a lot, and share some personal experiences here. So finding your balance, thoughts about neurosurgery, exploration, and the arts. So I have a passion not only for neurosurgery, but as a child, I was very interested in exploration. I read all the books about the big explorers. I always loved photography and the arts. So, and that is really something that has stayed with me throughout the years, but I kind of had to rediscover it. And really, that's what I want to talk about. It's a passion that I had to rediscover. And I want to encourage all of you, as you go on your journey in neurosurgery, which is a very, very tough journey, try to remember, what are your passions outside neurosurgery? And that's what I'll talk about. My disclosures are not really going to have any meaning here. We talked about William Osler, and Jody and Joe very nicely kind of summarized really the importance that William Osler had for medical students, for medical graduates. And as we heard in 1889, he gave a memorable address to the graduates at the time where he talked about equanimitas, which essentially, is the translation is equanimity. But for him, it was important to instill in his students the quality of imperturbability. If you think that's a difficult word to spell, try the German translation, okay, which is much harder. Imperturbability is the ability to remain calm and collected, peaceful, and gain strength through that calmness. The other thing that he mentioned was equanimity, which is essentially the state of mental imperturbability, balanced engagement with life, which produces emotional stillness, peacefulness, calmness. And why is that important? Well, we heard Joe mention that before, because in order to really take good care of patients and show empathy and compassion to patients, we as physicians or healthcare providers have to have an internal calmness. Otherwise, if we're panicking all the time because of all the things that happen to us, we're not going to be able really to take good care of patients. So that all pertains to our professional aspect, right? Marcus Aurelius, we heard that, so I'm not going to repeat that. So in terms of our professional life as physicians, equanimity is very, very important. Fast forward almost 100 years, Joe Maroon, to the presidential address in 1986 to the Congress of Neurological Surgeons. And which is really one of the few presidential addresses that people still remember. If you talk to people, especially older people now, they'll always remember that talk that he gave in 1986. So, and he talked about equanimity, but he was really trying to expand that concept to not only refer to our professional lives, but also to refer to us as a holistic human being. And the way he did that was by referring to William Danforth, who was really a business person who in the 1930s, based on his experience and his philanthropy, published a book called I Dare You. And I'm sure since you know Joe very well, you've heard about this book, of course. And in this book, Danforth described the square as something that we should try to strive for in order to live a balanced life, not only a professionally balanced life, but really a balanced life as a holistic person. And what are the sides of the square? So it's obviously the professional life, it's our family, our social aspect, which is one side of the square, the physical, the health aspect of our life, and then finally also the spiritual. And as a perfect square is supposed to be, all these sides are supposed to be of equal length. Now, as Joe pointed out in his presidential address for a neurosurgeon, that's usually not the case. It wasn't then, probably is not, neither is it now. Our professional line usually is much, much longer. And for other people, it may be something else. So what Joe then really propagated over the years, and he wrote a wonderful book that's now in the second edition, was the concept how to really put this into practice. So how can you incorporate the square in your professional life, in your personal life, to become a more rounded human being that integrates into society and essentially has a happy life. So this Danforth square, however, is very important. And Danforth said, you have not one but four lives to live, a fourfold opportunity to grow. A body, a brain, a heart, and a soul, these are our living tools. To use them is not a task, it is a golden opportunity. So keep that in mind. So these are the four sides to the square. Brain is professional, body is physical, soul is spiritual, heart is family and social. Now, as I was preparing for this talk, I thought, well, this is great, and how have I incorporated that in my life? And then I thought about certain things that have helped me over the years to kind of live a balanced life. And as I mentioned initially, my passion, I was always interested in exploration and the arts. And I thought, well, how does that fit in there? Well, maybe, and I hate to say that now with Joe sitting here, but maybe it's actually not a square, maybe it's a pentagon. Maybe there's one more side to it, namely your passions and your interests. Or depending on how you interpret that, maybe it's actually part of all of this, right? So I'll talk to you about how I kind of am trying to find my balance and how do we find equanimity, ataraxia in Greek, or equanimitas in Latin. And what was important for me in kind of preparing this lecture, I thought back, when I got my job at Cornell, Phil Steeg, who's still the chairman there now, he took me out to dinner. We went to Elaine's on the Upper East Side. That's closed now, but we had a wonderful dinner right before I was starting. And Phil asked me, Roger, what's your passion? Now, what drives you? And I was sitting there thinking, well, of course, neurosurgery. I'm supposed to say neurosurgery, spine surgery. I just came back from my spine fellowship in Phoenix. But then, and I said, oh, of course, Phil, neurosurgery, spine surgery. But in the back of my mind, I was always thinking, well, wait a minute. I mean, there's so many other things I'm interested in. You know, I love exploration. I love arts. I love traveling. I was not going to mention that at that dinner, of course. But it made me think, especially now in preparing this lecture, it made me think. So I said neurosurgery, spine surgery, but it was very clear that I had other passions. I just didn't have time or the energy or really the luxury to really explore those. And I was very interested in traveling, but also in reading about exploration and photography. That was always kind of one of my other interests. And for me, it was this, but for you, as you're sitting here, it may be something totally different. You may be into playing golf. You may love history books. You may love wine or restaurants. It doesn't matter. But I think you should all think about, well, what are the things that really drive me other than neurosurgery? Well, for me, I did my neurosurgery residency at Allegheny, then in Pittsburgh, Allegheny, then in New York at Cornell, and then my fellowship in Phoenix. But for me, kind of my rediscovery of my other passion that really became very important over the years began in 1999 when I was in Oxford in England. I was invited to a wedding, and I had a few hours time, and I walked through into a bookstore in Oxford. And I saw this gentleman sitting there in the bookstore. He looked like from a different century. He was almost 90 years old already. And he was signing books. And I looked at the books. The book was an amazing coffee table, large format book called Crossing the Sands. And then I started, and he signed the book for me. I have the book at home still. And this gentleman was Wilfred Thesiger, who died, unfortunately, a few years afterwards. But he was an incredible individual. And over the years, I kind of went back to read and learn more about him. He was born in Addis Ababa in 1910, which is now Ethiopia. He grew up, and his father was a diplomat in Africa. He grew up the first 10 years in Ethiopia, went back to England, went to Eton, to Oxford, got a proper education, but also always throughout his life, always returned back to Africa, to the Middle East, because he loved traveling, and he became one of the most renowned modern explorers, travel writers, and photographers. And I met him in Oxford in this bookstore, which was quite remarkable. So when I met him, I didn't know anything about him. But then I read up, and I met people who had spent time with him. So, and his biggest accomplishment throughout his career of traveling and exploring was, and I don't think there's a pointer here, but his biggest accomplishment was crossing and exploring the Arabian desert. And Arabia was founded as a country in the early 1900s by Abdul Aziz, who was the first monarch of Saudi Arabia. And then with the First World War, the mechanization, the cars, the airplanes, they really put to peace the northern part of Saudi Arabia. But there was a whole section in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula that was still totally unexplored. And that's called the Rub al-Khali, which is the desert that is indicated on the right side. It's the largest sand desert in the world. It's about 650,000 square kilometers. At the time when Thesiger was around, which was in the 30s and 40s, it was essentially unexplored. The indigenous people obviously lived there on the outskirts, but not inside the desert. It had been crossed once or twice by Europeans, but it was really unknown exactly, what was going to happen if we were trying to cross that land desert and that sand desert. And that was really Thesiger's passion. He made it his mission in his life. He wanted to be one of the first ones to actually cross this sand desert. And that's what he worked on. He was able to get transferred to Oman and to Yemen by the government for 5 years. That was right after the Second World War. So he lived there for 5 years. And throughout that time period, he traveled through the desert. He always traveled with local Arabs, the Rashid, which are the Arabs that live in that part of the desert. And even though he was not a trained photographer, he took one of the most amazing photographs. If you read up on Thesiger, he's really well known for his travel writing, but also for his photography, which was just spectacular. And this is and I started collecting his work over the years, his books and his photographs, and I wrote a book about it, which I'll show you some excerpts from. So, and he was a very special individual. I mean, he was very humble. He dressed like the Arabs. You know, they lived off the land, whatever the land had to give. And he wrote about really beautifully about his experiences and about his travels in the desert. I had learned the satisfaction which comes from hardship and the pleasure which derives from abstinence, the contentment of a full belly, the richness of meat, the taste of clean water, the ecstasy of surrender when the craving of sleep becomes a torment, the warmth of a fire and the chill of dawn. Oh, that reminds me of neurosurgery residency a lot, you know. So that it resonated when I read these lines. And this is now the map. And again, I apologize, I don't have a pointer here. But here, basically, you see the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. This is the Rub al Khali, the empty quarter. Dubai and Abu Dhabi are on the tip on the right. Oman is on the right side here. This is Yemen, and Qatar is up there. So he crossed the desert twice. In 46, 47, he went from Salah all the way up north. It's about 700-800 miles all the way up to Dubai. And then the following year, he crossed it again a little bit further on the west, here on the left side, going up, and then also to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. He always crossed the desert with a small group of Rashid Arabs. Those were all local Arabs, 5 or 6 Arabs. They had camels. They took the water, the food, whatever they took, they needed, they took with them. And there was always the risk of getting attacked by hostile tribes people. I mean, this part of the country was totally insecure in those days. This is one of the prints. There's a platinum print that I have at home. And he had really a family of people that he traveled with. This is a gentleman called Salim bin Kabina, who was leading these 2 camels over the sand dunes in the empty quarter. And like I said, he dressed like the locals. He didn't, you know, he was tall, so everybody could see that he was clearly not an Arab. And I don't think he was trying to come over as an Arab, but he just wanted, he wanted to live the life of the people that he traveled with, you know. So he didn't want to be a spectator from the outside. He really wanted to experience the traveling. So in the desert, I found the freedom unattainable in civilization, a life unhampered by possessions, since everything that was not a necessity was an encumbrance. I had found, too, a comradeship inherent to the circumstances and the belief that tranquility was to be found here. So he talks about tranquility, freedom, and a comradeship. Just imagine, you know, how can you find tranquility when your life is threatened every day? You don't know if you have enough water to drink, food to eat. So I think that Thesiger lived the perfect square. You know, I mean, he had the social environment. You know, he had the physical exercise of crossing the desert. You know, he spiritually, I think he really taught us how to live a square. And I want to remind all of you, I mean, try to think about that. You know, he had a passion that he was really striving for. What is your passion? It may not be exploration. It may be something totally different. But I think it's a great example of how somebody who understands what their passions are and goes for it can really realize his dreams. Another picture of Salim bin Kabina guiding the camels through the desert. No, it's not the goal, but the way there that matters. And the harder the way, the more worthwhile the journey. Again, neurosurgery, right? So this is a quote that you hear every once in a while. He crossed the empty quarter twice, 46, 47, and then again at 47, 48. In between, he would go back to England. He wrote. He was really like a neurosurgeon. He would do these things. He would write it up and publish it in the Royal Geographic Journal. You can pull it up. It's like a scientific article with maps, time, you know, how much food he brought. It was really a scientific project. And then he would go back to Arabia and spend time again with the Rashid crossing the desert. I owed everything to my companions, their lighthearted gallantry, their constancy and endurance. So he really created a family for himself. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures. When they crossed the desert the second time, they went to Dubai, and they spent a week on this boat. And this is just a beautiful picture. If you look at this kind of forward motion to the left, everybody working together, it's really teamwork. The reflection in the water, it's just a beautiful, beautiful picture that really symbolizes like the whole spirit of these travels that he did. And this is a sheikh, I forgot the name now, but this is the sheikh that he became very good friends with, who became eventually the first ruler of the Emirates. So this was in Dubai, Sheikh bin Sultan, I think. So he became the ruler. He just died in 2004. He's really the one who kind of started the United Arab Emirates. And they were very close with Thesiger. Even though Thesiger was very, very critical of what happened with Dubai and Abu Dhabi later on with the oil industry. He was very critical of any innovation. This is again Salim bin Kabina with a hunting dog in the empty quarter. Thesiger, even though in the desert he didn't take a lot of portraits, but later on when he traveled in Iraq, in the Himalayas, he became very well known for some of the beautiful portraits that he took of local people who lived there. And again, this is a picture of Salim bin Gabaya and Salim bin Kabina, who were his companions over those 5 years. Beautiful pictures in the desert. And these gentlemen, they may have died now, but a few years ago, they were still alive. This is from somebody who traveled to the Emirates who took pictures of these gentlemen many, many years later. And they obviously remember Thesiger very well. This is a town in Yemen, some portraiture that he did of little children in Yemen. And this is the book that he wrote. He didn't want to write a book about this. He was really forced by some of his friends then 10 years later to go back, and he went to Denmark for 2 months in seclusion to write down his memories of the 5 years that he spent in Arabia crossing the desert. That book then was published in 1959. This is the first British edition with his signature, and then the American edition came out shortly thereafter. You can see his iconic photographs on the cover. He didn't want to write the book. He was really forced to write it, but it was good that somebody forced him because it's considered one of the best pieces in travel literature. So if you get the chance, then I would urge you to pick up a copy and maybe read a little bit. So Alexander Maitland is his biographer. And as I was kind of discovering my passion for Thesiger and what he did, I did a lot of research. I did this at night, on weekends, after coming home, and you would think after operating for 12 hours you're tired, but then if you have a passion like this, you come home at midnight, it's you can still spend a few hours reading about Thesiger. I mean, it's actually really calming. It's a great experience. So I came across Alexander Maitland, who wrote a biography about Thesiger, and I would always email him, can you tell me this? Can you tell me that? Do you have any photographs? And he was initially very hesitant, but then finally I went to London. I met with him a few times actually, and it turned out that Alexander Maitland, who's also an incredible individual, was very, very close with Thesiger, and he actually lives in Thesiger's apartment in Chelsea, in London, and that was quite remarkable because you actually had access to Thesiger's apartment, private apartment where he used to live, with a beautiful library with artifacts from all over the world. So that was quite a pearl. And I really cherish that. Now, Alexander Maitland also pointed out that even though I talked about Arabia, Thesiger really spent most of his life in Africa. He was born in Ethiopia and he spent 5 years in Arabia, then in Iraq, but he always went back to Africa, and he spent the majority of his life really in Kenya and in Tanzania. And this is a picture that he took in the 1960s of young Maasai boys just a few weeks after the circumcision, when after the circumcision, they're allowed to carry bows and arrows, but they still have women's clothes. There's still one more ceremony that they have to go through until they can actually wear men's clothes. But this is, again, an example of how Thesiger documented things that nowadays we wouldn't know about a lot of this stuff if he hadn't taken beautiful pictures. So that brings me to Africa, and that brings me to, one of my passions, which was traveling, of course. And when I was, Joe mentioned I was a medical student in Munich, and I remember I met one of my co-students, a lady who came back, and she said she had spent a few months in Malawi. And I had no idea where Malawi was, and you couldn't Google it. There was no Google. So I had to look it up on a map, and I realized, it's a small country just south of Tanzania down here. So I said, well, I would love to do that. I would love to go to Malawi. And she was a medical student, so she had worked there in the hospital. So I asked her, how do I get there? So she got me in touch with people. I wrote letters. I got some letters back from the physician in Malawi from a Seventh-day Adventist hospital. So during my vacation time, then we set out, we flew to Nairobi in Kenya, and we hitchhiked through Tanzania. And then there was no street, there was no road to Malawi. We actually had to walk for several miles to get into Malawi. And then I spent 6 weeks or 2 months working in that hospital in Malawi, which was really an eye-opening experience. So, and I always tell my kids, you should try to combine what you have to do with what you really want to do. I had to work in a hospital to satisfy my paperwork for medical school. So why not do it in Malawi? What a great experience. So my kids are always complaining. I said, look, you should try to combine one with the other. So that's what I was trying to do. And that's what it really stuck. Really discovered something that I wanted to pursue for the rest of my life. Now, then going into neurosurgery, residency, of course, was difficult because there was no time really to spend time in Africa or travel a lot. But it was only afterwards. I graduated in 2004, 2005. It turned out that our anatomy professor at Cornell is from Tanzania, and he was best friends with the gentleman who became president of Tanzania, who happened to be in New York. He had a neck problem. So I took care of him. And that was the connection then, how I got invited back to Tanzania. But it doesn't take a president to invite you. Anybody can go to Tanzania, of course. Just for me, I really didn't know how to go back there. And in retrospect, it would have been so easy. But anyway, I was invited back to Tanzania to visit the country for a few weeks. And then I said, well, of course, if I come back, I would love to go to the hospital. So I went to the hospital in Dar es Salaam, and I met Dr. Kinasha, who's the doctor up there, who was one of the 3 neurosurgeons in Tanzania. Now, there were 3 neurosurgeons taking care of the whole country, basically. And so they were all in this one hospital. So in 2008, then I got there, and I brought some Synthes at the time, gave us some implants. So I brought some implants with me, and we started doing some cases together. And that was really, that stuck with me. And then it helped that Cornell actually has an affiliation with a medical school in Tanzania. That was helpful. And my chairman was very supportive. So I ended up going back essentially every year to Tanzania. And then the things that you see there, obviously, just in terms of pathology, are just mind blowing. I remember this little girl who had a posterior fossa tumor. There was a CT scanner there that was not always working. Now it's much better, but back then a lot of the scanners wouldn't work half the time. And even if they worked, there's nothing you could do. There was no microsurgery, no microscope. You could put a catheter in and drain the hydrocephalus, but there was no real treatment for these types of pathologies. There was a whole ward with children with hydrocephalus. They would be there with their whole families waiting for a surgeon to come in, or local surgeon to have extra time and shunt catheters to treat these patients. It was just really miserable. This was one of the first cases that we saw in that year when I came. And I don't know if you can see that here, but this patient was awake alert in the ICU in the cervical collar. Obviously had a motor vehicle accident, a lot of fractures. But you can see the odontoid process is subluxed forward on top of C1. So they said, oh, let's do this case tomorrow. So, and I was, oh my God, what am I going to do? And we ended up, this is a different patient, but we ended up doing occipital cervical fusion. Synthes had given us some screws and rods, and we used lateral mass screws in the occiput because we didn't have any cortical screws. But this patient reduced just by positioning him prone. He had already reduced, so we just fixed him in place and used some bone graft. And that went very well. So that was the first case that we did there. And then over the years, every year we would come back, sometimes with colleagues, sometimes with anesthesiologists, sometimes with nurses, students, and in 2011, I remember Volker Sonntag came from Phoenix, which was great. We spent a week in the hospital, and then we went on safari together, and that was a lot of fun. I was also lucky that Phil Steek, my chairman, was very, very supportive over all these years. He let me go there every year, and he actually joined many times. And I think he was the first one to clip an aneurysm in that hospital, or in Tanzania probably. And that was a great experience when he came, and maybe he'll come again next year. We had a photojournalist, Andre Leon. He's a Brazilian award winning photojournalist who came with us one year and took beautiful pictures that I'm very, very excited about. And this was the equipment. This was the neurosurgical equipment when we got there the first year. A Hudson brace, right? You recognize a few of those instruments. I mean, that's what they had to do neurosurgery, not much. And then you walk into the operating room. I mean, look at this. It's a mess. I mean, and I don't want to say anything bad. I mean, they're trying hard, right? They don't have the resources. It's poorly organized. That was the CT scanner that didn't really work half the time. And then no OR lights. So we would use flashlights for the surgery. This we can see here sometimes too, probably. But it was just miserable. And this is from Paul Farmer, who was a global health physician from Harvard that many of you probably know of. He passed away, unfortunately, but he wrote a paper in 2008 saying that surgery is the neglected stepchild of global public health. And that is really true, especially in Africa. So then over the years, what happened was, and again, I can't say that I trained 20 neurosurgeons. I contributed. I mean, we all contributed, and we kind of played a small role in this, but we certainly didn't train them. What we did was really over the years, and I'll summarize it on the next slide, is we try to be present every year. We created fellowships for people to go back and forth. And I was very, very reluctant to bring in equipment because of my connection to the president of Tanzania. The first thing that he did after we went there, he gave the hospital a Zeiss microscope. And of course, what happened the next day, the microscope was broken, okay? And that microscope is still now, 20 years later, is in the corner somewhere because they didn't have a maintenance plan. They didn't pay for the maintenance. Something broke and nobody knew how to fix it. So I realized very quickly that bringing equipment is not the solution. It's actually the last thing they need. What really is important is to teach, to train, to have the connection, regular communication, maybe collect data. But bringing equipment in is not really important. It was only now recently, last year, that we decided to really support with equipment. Now, I had the confidence that they have the infrastructure now to take care of this. Like BrainLab, for example, donated a navigation system. We brought in virtual reality for one of the courses and did conferences now with virtual reality. With a Massimo Balsano, who's a deformity surgeon from Italy, and Ala Ahmed, who's from Palestine, a deformity surgeon, incredible individuals. I helped them put together a scoliosis course. So they did for 3-month Zoom meetings every weekend, identifying patients, and then they went there for a week. We got implants from companies as donations, and they did surgery. They trained the surgeons there to do these cases almost independently now. So a lot of this is really falls into the category of leapfrogging, right? We're trying to really quickly advance their capabilities by introducing technologies that otherwise would probably take decades to get in there. And it's a little bit controversial, I understand that, but I think it's working. Like tubular surgery, you know, I do a lot of minimally invasive surgery. I always thought, well, tubes would be amazing in Africa. If you can do, instead of doing an open incision with infection risk, you can do all the degenerative work through tubes. And we've done tubular surgery. Well, what happens if you do tubular surgery, though, is you have epidural bleeding. And what do you do with epidural bleeding if you don't have flow seal, gel form, thrombin, nothing? So the first few cases that we did were disasters. It was a great idea, you know, tubular surgery in Africa was a disaster. So now we still do it, but we bring thrombin, and that's not really sustainable, right? They really would have to come up with this themselves. What may be sustainable, though, may be spinal endoscopy. And we had Lynn McGrath, who's one of our faculty, who's a great endoscopic spine surgeon. We got a system from Joymax that we brought in March, and we, not me, but some of the others and him, they did 1 week of endoscopic spine surgery there. And I think that may be actually be that may be something for Tanzania. Bleeding is not really an issue. They're very, very good with cranial endoscopy. I mean, they go to villages in the middle of nowhere to treat hydrocephalus with cranial endoscopy. So very, very good with 2D surgery. And I think spinal endoscopy may be something that's really exciting for Tanzania. And we're trying to see if Joymax or some other company maybe donates a system for Tanzania. Now, so these are the lessons really learned for me over those 7 years, and that is then that, you know, to make a program like this sustainable, you have to go at least once a year. I can't go more than that because I don't have enough time. But how do you make a program work then? Well, we have a symposium every year, a global health neurosurgery symposium that we put together, and then we have fellows that go back and forth. We help them with clinical research. We have weekly Zoom conferences, and then we publish together. And that has been a very, very robust way of really having a reasonable relationship. Now, Joe mentioned I was awarded the humanitarian award, which was amazing. But none of this is possible without many people, of course, in the background helping. So my chairman and many, many others locally, obviously, most of all, the people in Tanzania. This is our fellow Magali on the right side. She's from Canada. She's a spine surgeon. She's going to go back to St. Louis to take a job now next month. And then some of the other fellows we have locally. So this is really, without the fellows, this would never work. Now, I want to talk about my other passion too. Do you still have time? Yeah. So, you know, Tanzania is a beautiful country. You know, we talked about the hospital there. The tallest mountain in Africa is in Tanzania, Mount Kilimanjaro. And who here in the audience has climbed Kilimanjaro? Yeah, two. There we go. I haven't. I never have time, but I would love to. But Joe obviously climbed it 10 years ago. And I remember he sent pictures when he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And in the book, he writes about the experience, how that really fit into the square. You know, it was a beautiful experience because it was all about balance and achieving, you know, the balance that you're looking for. And you could talk about this much more than I can, but I really admire you for doing that, and also in the context how you did that. Life is a mountain, not a beach. I'm sure you guys agree with that, especially in neurosurgery. Now, I want to talk a little bit about mountaineering, but also about your passions. Remember, the purpose is to talk about passions and how do passions relate to well-being and pain. You know, a lot of what we do, especially in mountaineering, there's the passion of climbing a mountain, but then there's the pain that's involved, or doing a triathlon. You know, the passion that you have to compete, but the pain that you have to go through to get there, right? Now, there's a philosopher, Arne Næss, from a Norwegian philosopher who wrote about this a lot. He coined the term deep ecology, so he's really very involved. He was very involved in the environmental movement. But I picked this part that I was interested in, where he writes about well-being, and he said that well-being is proportional to the square of the level of glow meaning passion, divided by pain. Okay. So what does that mean? So that means that passion is so much more important than pain. You know, a small increase in passion that you develop for anything, could be neurosurgery, mountaineering, wine tasting, whatever it is, a small degree increase in passion is greatly going to outweigh the pain that you have to go through to get there, right? Or in other words, really, it is more valuable to increase your glow or your passion than it is to try to reduce your pain. You know, most of us, we're trying to reduce pain, but maybe what we should be doing is we should probably try to find what we're really passionate about. And maybe that would be more worthwhile. And that obviously is important in mountaineering. And you know, there are other mountains than Kilimanjaro. There's close to Tanzania, there are the mountains of the moon, the Ruwenzori Ridge. It's not far from Tanzania. And that brings me to the other person that I was very interested in. And that's Vittorio Sella on the lower right corner, on the right side, that small picture. That Vittorio Sella was a photographer and a mountaineer from northern Italy. His dates were 1859 to 1943. And he traveled all over the world with the Duke of the Abruzzi, who's here on the left side. This was in the New York Times in 1906. They just came back from Africa. They were the first ones to actually climb the Ruwenzori mountain range, or the Mountains of the Moon, which was quite an accomplishment back then. And that's why it's on the New York Times on the first page here. And Sella was an exceptional photographer. He was the first one to do panoramic images. So they would carry up this heavy camera equipment up the mountains. This is actually a picture that I have at home. There's actually 4 pictures put together. That's the panorama image of the Ruwenzori Mountains in the early 1900s, right after they had actually climbed that mountain range. Like I said, Vittorio Sella was from northern Italy, a photographer and a mountaineer. This is some of the work that he did in the 1800s, like the 1890s. This is in the French Alps, when they climbed these glaciers and mountain peaks. And it's quite remarkable what he did. Just like with Thesiger, where I went to London to visit his biographer, I had the opportunity then also during COVID actually to go to northern Italy to visit where Sella was from. Now, Sella's family was famous for weaving. I don't know, Loro Piana, Zegna, all these weaving mills. They're all in that factory in that village where Sella is from. And so he was kind of like the black sheep of the family as a photographer. That's the dark room that he used. And then if you look at the equipment that he had to carry up the mountains was quite heavy and quite remarkable. These are some of his climbing buddies that he went out with in the 1800s, 1890s. And this is the Duke of the Abruzzi, who was the cousin of the King of Italy at the time. And he's the one who paid for all these expeditions that they went on. They went to Mount St. Elias in Alaska, which they climbed, the first ones to climb that. They went to the Ruwenzori Mountains. They went to the Himalayas. He went to the North Pole. The Duke of the Abruzzi went to the North Pole, but not Sella. I mean, they went all over the world, and this was all financed through the Duke of the Abruzzi, who's here on the right side. One of the most beautiful mountain pictures ever taken, 1899. This is in the Indian Himalayas, Sinyoluchu. A beautiful picture of that mountain. Mount Yanu is also in the Himalayas. That was one of the first pictures taken with a telelens. You know, he would use telelenses to take some of these pictures. Ansel Adams, who was one of the most famous photographers in North America that many of you are probably familiar with, he actually really, he knew about Sella, and he was very impressed and adored Sella. He wrote in his obituary that was published in the Sierra Club Bulletin in 1946, so 3 years after Sella died, he wrote about Sella. You know, Sella has brought to us not only the facts and forms of far-off splendors of the world, but the essence of experience, which finds a spiritual response in the inner recesses of our mind and heart. And again, now Sella, what was he most famous for? We talked about Thesiger and the Rupal Kali. Well, Sella was really most famous then for the expedition that he did with the Duke of the Abruzzi to the Karakoram, to the Himalayas, and they were trying to climb K2, which is the second highest mountain in the world, 8,600 meters, 28,000 feet. So not only the second highest, but probably the most difficult, technically the most difficult, which obviously they didn't know that at the time, but they literally went out there on an 8-month expedition trying to get to K2, explore K2, and hopefully climb it. Now, it was eventually climbed in the 1950s, 1954, by an Italian team. It was climbed over the Abruzzi spur, the red spur here, which was named after the Duke of the Abruzzi, just to honor his exploratory work that he had done. This is the map that they drew when they got there. So K2 is up there, and we went there a few years ago. We were tracking to K2 base camp. So you walk up the Baltoro Glacier for 5 or 6 days, which is a huge glacier, of course. You come to this area here where 4 or 5 glaciers all come together. That's called the Concordia. It's a beautiful vista, beautiful view. And you walk here, and then you look left, and then suddenly you see at the end of that valley K2, and I'll show you some pictures. It's quite remarkable. And this is the Duke of the Abruzzi here on the Baltoro Glacier. This is actually the Duke. You know, he's not carrying anything. The others are carrying the heavy equipment. And this, I'm not going to go. There's a little video kind of showing But then K2 was eventually climbed in the 1950s, 1954, by an Italian team. The main climber was Ardito Desio, and that's the book with his signature and some of the climbers' signatures. And that was all done based on Vittorio Sella's exploration. And actually, before they went to K2 in 1954, they went to Biella, they went to Sella's archives, and they got a lot of the pictures that he took of K2 because nobody else had really good pictures of the mountain. And then they went there, they were successful to climb the mountain. And this is one of Vittorio Sella's picture of K2 that was enlarged. And this is signed by all the climbers from 1954. And this is the picture, like when you come around the Baltoro Glacier and you come from the left here, you look right, you look left, and you see that mountain in the background, which is quite remarkable. The base camp is right around here, and then on the right side is Broad Peak, which is another high mountain and very difficult to climb. And this is Sella's masterpiece. You know, if you talk to people and who know his work, I think everybody will probably agree. This is a panoramic shot, and these are like six or seven panels that he did of the whole Baltoro region. So from left to right, and this is 360 degrees. So this is K2 here. This is Broad Peak. The Gasherbrum peaks, and there's Chogolisa or Bride Peak, that mountain there. And that's actually a mountain that they almost climbed. They came up to 7,000 meters, which was at the time the altitude record. On K2, they didn't get very high, but on Chogolisa, they actually got pretty high up, and then because of bad weather, they had to return. So it was a quite remarkable and really successful expedition on a whole. Now, on the top, you see Sella's panoramic image. On the bottom, you see a series of images that were done exactly 100 years later. And this was done by David Brashears, who is he just passed away from an aneurysm, believe it or not, most likely. He's a climber who was a photographer, filmmaker. He did a lot of documentary movies and films. And his goal was really to find the spot where Sella had taken these images. He wanted to get to the same spot and take exactly the same pictures 100 years later. And in the book that I put together, he talks about that. So this is Sella up there with the camera that he took up there. That's the map. And we were trying to figure out, because this was not taken from the valley, of course. In order to take this picture, you have to climb up to, on the other side, you have to climb up to about 17,000 feet or so to take this picture. And based on the map, there was an indication that he had taken this picture from this spot. You know, we took a picture of this miserable mountain there, which is very hard to get to. He probably took that picture, that panoramic picture, from that spot. And that's where David Brashears had to climb up to take the same image, which he did. And he found exactly the same spot. That's his autobiography, High Exposure. It was an amazing guy. Unfortunately, he passed away. Well, that's K2. Now we trekked up for 6 days. And then fortunately, we were able to hitch a ride with the military helicopter back. So we weakened out a little bit. I apologize. But it was great to save 6 days, so we didn't have to walk down. But the military took us back down to the valley. That's Broad Peak Base Camp, and then in the back, that's K2. And we spent 6 to 7 days really trying to get to K2 Base Camp. That's K2 there. Then we went back to Skardu, Islamabad, and then I did some, with a friend, we did some cases in Islamabad, some MIS TLIFs. So this is this was at the base. Then when we got back with a helicopter, airspeed, altitude, and brains, you need 2 of the 3 to stay alive. Well, and then, you know, with my interest and passion in books, photography, these explorers, I was able then slowly over the course of 10 years to put together a collection of books, photography, and was able to show this at the Grolier Club in New York, which is a club for book lovers and book collectors. So I had a show there a few years ago, and these are those 2 panoramas. They're about 90-inch wide, right? and then a lot of the other work I showed you in this presentation. And then we put together a book about the experience. And these are just some shots from the Golia Club where we showed the photography. Now, coincidentally, then while the show, like maybe a year before the show, this patient walks into my office. She's an old, lovely lady from Italy. She walks into my office and she says, "Oh, doctor, I have terrible back pain." She had neurogenic claudication. And then she said, "What happened to you?" Well, I had surgery a year ago and I still have the same pain. And I was looking at her name. It sounded somewhat familiar. And then I looked at her films, and she had neurogenic claudication, not a lot of back pain, but really she couldn't walk. So I looked at the films, and she had that was done somewhere else. She had a beautiful minimal invasive, the least invasive fusion I've ever seen. They put 2 cages in, no screws for some reason, bone cement. And then we got the MRI scan, and the MRI scan shows that she still has the problem. She still has lumbar spinal stenosis. So they never treated that apparently. And not only does she have stenosis at L4-5, now she's got adjacent segment disease, right? So we treated her with a decompression, and she did very well. And it turns out that and then I looked up her name. It turns out that she's actually a relative of the Duke of the Abruzzi, which was funny. It was like full circle. And that was when I was working on this book, and we had some letters of the Duke of the Abruzzi that were written in old Italian that nobody could read. So I asked her to translate the letters, which is what she did. And that was just a nice kind of coincidental experience. My childhood hero, and I'm pretty much done now, but my childhood hero when I grew up was Reinhold Messner. He was the first climber to climb all 8,000-meter peaks, and I would read all his books. He was like my hero. And I was able to meet him in New York at a Alpine Club dinner one year, and I asked him to write something for the book that we put together on Thesiger and Sella, and he wrote this little forward, which is really nice. Vittorio Sella and Wilfred Thesiger have visualized a curiosity, one with Ushba, which is a mountain in the Caucasus range, which Sella also visited, the Mustang Tower, which is close to K2, and obviously K2. The other with the empty quarter in Oman and Saudi Arabia. Their photographs and vivid prose stimulate the human imagination for all time. So I thought that was very nice. And then finally, a few words about exploration and neurosurgery. I don't know if you came across this book, The Explorers by Martin Dugard. It's really, he talks about the exploration of Africa, the North Pole, the South Pole, and he mentions certain characteristics that are unique to explorers. Curiosity, hope, passion, courage, independence, self-discipline, perseverance. Sounds familiar? Well, if you look at we have this in our department, that's the core values of neurosurgery: integrity, collegiality, compassion, perseverance, leadership, curiosity, technical superiority. So I think it's obvious. I mean, there's a lot of overlap here. We shouldn't feel too good about this, but I think it's interesting to see that there are certain parallels that and it makes it easier to kind of justify the time that I spent with my interest in exploration. It's not so far off from neurosurgery, maybe. So finally, now, how to achieve balance? I think, again, the square is really the key. Try to think about that. Professional life, your physical life, try to work out. Family, social is so important. What I came away from preparing this lecture was passion and glow. I think on top of that, or maybe part of the square, is also passion. Without passion, I think life would be very boring. And I was really impressed by Arne Nace's work because, and especially that equation that he said, it is more valuable to increase one's glow or passion than to try to reduce one's pain. So keep that in mind. Whatever your passion is, try to make the passion more important. Don't focus on the pain. If the passion is high enough, you'll forget about the pain. Same with our patients, by the way. Right? Let's tell them about our patients too. Finally, I want to thank my mentors, and I really have in neurosurgery, I have 3 mentors. The first one is you, Joe. You took me into this program. You were always a role model for me, and a friend now, almost more than a mentor, but still a mentor. Obviously, then professionally, Volker Sonntag was an incredible person to spend time with. The lessons that I learned, not only in the operating room, but really in evaluating patients. And I want to remind you, for those of you who go into spine, even more so than maybe in other disciplines, it's all about evaluating patients' decision-making process. It's so important, and Volker was an incredible role model in that regard. And then finally, Phil Steek, who gave me the job at Cornell, came up with this list of qualities that he wanted to instill. That's the first thing. When he showed up on day one, becoming a chairman, he already had that list and talked about that. And this is at one of the Giants-Steelers game that probably the Giants lost, but when Joe and Phil and I were there, so it was a nice picture. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't bore you too much, and this was of interest. And like Joe said, if you're in New York in December, join us at our NICMIS course, or in August, we have one, also a practical course. So thank you very much.
Did you enjoy climbing Mountain?
Yeah, well, it's, I enjoy being outdoors, I mean, but climbing mountains is amazing. As long as your muscles don't hurt.
Well, on behalf of the AHN Department of Neurosurgery and on behalf of Dr. Maroon, we would like to present this plaque to you.
Thank you so much.
We can come here. Thank you. And then, Zach, if you could just switch back to my presentation for a second, please. And next slide. And just go to the next slide, Zach. 2 slides from now. The next one will be a blank one. Go ahead and then the next slide. So it is my pleasure. So this is the second Aequanimitas Lectureship Award. And the way that we did this is we sent out a survey email to our faculty and chose the winner of this award. So I'd like to congratulate, and can you go to the next slide? Dr. So you were chosen. And next slide, please. And today is all about our graduates. So if I can please have the one and only Dr. Dorian Cusick and the one and only Alejandro. We are going to present to you the chairs, and Dr. Whiting, Dr. Yu, do you want to come on up? Next slide, please. Come on up. Next slide, please. And just to summarize the events for tonight. Yeah, just stay right here. So tonight's graduation is going to be on the north side at our own national aviary. So we'll start 6:00 p.m. And tonight's a very special evening because we have a few guests that were specifically invited, I believe by Dorian, the Pittsburgh Penguins, not the hockey team, but penguins, actual penguins will be at our cocktail hour. The penguins will get there around 6:30. They're only going to come for a little small amount of time. So I would encourage everybody to be there by 6:00 p.m. 7:00 p.m. will be dinner, and then 8:00 p.m. we will start our graduation ceremony. So thank you everyone for coming today. And Dr. Hartl, thank you so much for such a spectacular lecture. And Dr. Maroon, we would never be here without you. So thank you. And we'll see everybody tonight.
Thank you.